We're recording the interview of Larry Otto. This interview is being conducted by Ericka Carter from the Wright State University Veterans Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University in the New Media Incubator. It is 11:15 a.m. on October 30th, 2019. How are you today?
I'm outstanding, thank you.
Fantastic. Where and when were you born?
Well, let's go even back before that. There was a big dust bowl in South Dakota at that time, and of course it was during the after effects of a lot of tragedies that had occurred. And there happened to be a dust storm that day that was very severe. And that date was April 1st. So I consider I was conceived on April 1st during a dust storm. And I was born during the worst blizzard they'd had in years in Redfield, South Dakota on January 1st, 1934.
So that's pretty specific. Did you assume that, or did your parents help you with that information?
I made it up, except for the birth date.
Okay. Who are your parents and what were their occupations?
My mother was from Minnesota, and she was a school teacher at age 17 that came down to teach in a school in Tulare, South Dakota. And my father was of German descent from a family that had broken up the buffalo grass and had originally staked their claim on 160 acres and lived in a dugout that was referred to in those days as a dugout, made of the turf of the buffalo grass and stacked to make a living quarters. And that was in about 1878 when the Dakota Territory opened up.
Okay. What grades did your mother teach?
She taught the lower grades, and we have a certificate of responsibility, and she was paid $40 a month with the duties that included she had to sweep the floors and light the fire, and specifically she wasn't allowed to read during school hours any books for pleasure.
Was it uncommon for women to be able to read then?
No, it was very common, but a lot of them didn't go through formal schooling. They just went through their high school. And my mother was lucky enough to be in a family in Duluth, Minnesota, where they went all the way through high school.
And this was back in the 1800s?
Yes.
Okay. Did you have any siblings?
Yes, I had two brothers that really, when you grow up isolated on a farm, that they become your best friends. The oldest brother, Robert, was 15 years older than I was, and the middle brother, Richard, was 8 years older than I was. And both of them had a very big influence in my life. And I would classify them as, when you're young, they're your best friends.
It seems a little odd that there would only be three of you, especially so far apart in years, to live on a farm. Back in the 1800s, they...
Well, you're correct in that, because my German grandfather, Herman Otto, they had 12 children, 7 boys and 5 girls. And they had immigrated from the port of Stettin, which is now part of Poland, but it was called the Port of Berlin, and came to this country on their wedding, and they had a ticket to go back, and they traded that ticket to come on a cattle car to Wisconsin, where he was hired by a Swedish family to help run the farm, and 4 of the children were born there, and then the Dakota Territory opened up, and he went out there to help break the sod. The dugout was called a soddy, as the sod in the ground.
Okay. So you're not having a bunch of brothers and sisters, was that purposeful or just
I think it
purpose?
was because of the conditions at the time, and probably maybe had something to do with the sensitivity of my mother.
Okay. Okay.
It seems that some women have a great deal to say so in how many children they have,
That
or
is,
when they get pregnant.
that is very true. That is very true. Did any of your siblings serve in the military?
Yes,
Okay.
Robert ended up, no, we ended up in Grand Coulee Dam, and we lived on the Columbia River. And Bob worked on Grand Coulee Dam, helping bring things to the people that were drilling with jackhammers on the cliffs, bringing them new tools. And he'd swing like Tarzan across the ropes to bring them the tools on the face of the cliff. And he ended up being in super shape, so when it was about time for the draft to start, he was notified that the next day he was going to be drafted into the Army. Now, having spent so much time in the Dust Bowl and eating dust, the last thing he wanted to do was be in the Army and dig trenches. So he went down that same day and enlisted in the Navy.
Okay.
And he ended up on the battleship California when the Japanese attacked, and he was the runner for the duty officer that morning.
How did you find out about all of this during that time? When he got home, was he actively writing you letters? How were you guys communicating?
Well, we found out about the attack on Pearl Harbor when my mother and my brother Richard had driven back to South Dakota to visit family, and we heard about it shortly after December 7th while we were staying in Tulare, South Dakota with family.
How old were you when this happened?
Well, it was December 7th, 1941, and I was born in 34. So that says I was about 13 going on 14.
How did you feel about it?
At that time, it was just a great adventure, and I didn't understand it.
Were you nervous for your brother? Were you scared? Or did you think, oh man, he's got it because he's big, strong, and I love him?
No, the real reaction was we were in Dakota, and we knew that gas rationing was coming up, and we had to get back to our home in a place below Grand Coulee Dam called Elmer City. And we knew there was going to be rationing, and you'd be short on tires and everything, so we packed up the 38 Ford and headed back. And that's all I remember was the trip back.
Okay. I imagine at 13 you were still in school yourself?
Yes.
Okay. What was Richard doing at that time? He was about...
Let me correct that. My mathematics is wrong. That was 1941, and I was born in 34, so I was 7 years old.
Okay.
And the major thing I remember about South Dakota was in the winter, it's very cold, and where you have to go to the bathroom is outside in an outhouse.
That does not sound fun.
Nope.
I've done it before, but it's in the Army, but it's not fun. I can completely imagine why your brother was like, hey, I'm gonna go to the Navy.
Yep.
Yep, I'll be on a boat. That sounds way better. So your brother leaves, he's of age. You make the decision to go into the military.
Well, you ask about brothers, what were they in the military?
Okay, so...
And we've got to go back to Richard.
All right, let's talk about Richard.
Now, Richard, we ended up, and we lived in Elmer City, which was on an Indian reservation. So he had to commute to the Nespelem Indian Reservation High School. And he was very sharp and very smart. And so we come along, and at a certain time, and he's in the 11th grade, and we moved to Spokane, Washington. So he gets to Spokane, and he's a senior in high school, and he graduates, and he joins the Navy V5, V12 program, which is kind of a cadet program, and it's the same program that President Bush joined to become an aviator, and he was shot down flying an Avenger in World War II and rescued by a submarine. So my brother, Richard, now is in this program, but he's held back because the skills in mathematics are not there. Because on the Indian reservation, all they taught the Indians and my brother was how to change money, because they get their substance each month would come in and they'd get so much money and they'd have to learn how to spend it so nobody would cheat them. And so that was the extent of his mathematical skills. And to be a naval aviator, you had to be able to navigate, which required a lot higher mathematics than how do you change money. So it probably saved his life.
That is true. So he got held back. When did he finish the did he ever finish that?
Yeah, he got his wings at the end of World War II in Pensacola, Florida. He was a naval aviator.
It seems you moved a lot.
Pardon?
It seems that you did a lot of moving.
Well, in the early years, yes, because at 3.5 years we moved from our farm, and we moved in a trailer that was built by my father that was patterned off a commercial trailer, travel trailer that he had followed the pattern and built one on a frame of an old Essex car. And that was pulled by a 1931 Ford two-door with a 40 horsepower engine and mechanical brakes. The trailer had no brakes, and it was rather squirrely to drive. And my dad was not that adept at it, and the trailer tried to pass us up one time, and Bob didn't let him drive after that. So Bob was the primary driver. We stopped en route to get more gas money, and Bob and my dad worked at the Mount Rushmore outside of Rapid City until they got enough money ahead to buy gasoline and other items to travel. My mother cooked on a gas burner stove, and she had an oven that would collapse with an isinglass door on it that she'd bake bread in.
Wow. What kind of work would they do to make money?
Well, they'd do anything they could. They'd work on the construction crew on the roads. They'd work on the trailings at Mount Rushmore. My dad, in addition to being a farmer, was a contractor, primarily in building barns and buildings and foundations and concrete.
Did you pick up any of those skill trades?
Oh, absolutely. I picked up everything I could as a little boy to learn things and become adept at doing what it needed to be done to get something fixed. It often wasn't pretty, but it was very practical. So the pretty never stuck with me, but the practical did.
Have you been able to use those skills throughout your life?
Absolutely, especially in the test world, because you can never count on things the way they are planned. Sometimes you have to adapt.
That seems very, very important. I'm sure you appreciated your parents for those skills. Okay. So Bob and Richard joined the military. Was it ever a sense of patriotism that drove them to that, or was it necessity? Why did they feel, well, I understand Bob was a part of the draft. Was Richard?
Yeah, he was coming up on draft. He was 17, finished high school, and his number was coming up. And Bob had always been inspirational in building things. He'd watched a airplane had crashed, and it had a what they called a Henderson motorcycle engine, which was basically Indian bought it. It was called an Indian Square 4, but they had a propeller on it, and they'd take that. He took it, he bought it from the wrecking yard, and he built a wind-driven ice boat. Not a wind-driven, but a propeller-driven. The problem was the kids from all over the countryside would come up when they'd hear this 4-cylinder no exhaust system come alive, and they'd come running over, and the propeller wasn't shielded, so he's afraid that some kid would walk into it because you couldn't see it. So he'd have to shut it down. And that kind of lit our imagination in aviation. Now, Brother Dick ended up getting his private pilot's license when he was 16 years old at a gravel strip that was next to the sand pit that was used to help build the, or help produce the concrete that went into Grand Coulee Dam. And we had during the building of our dugout that was built out of the coffer dams that were blown up from the Grand Coulee Dam would come down, floating downstream. He bought a Model A pickup truck, or really a flatbed truck. And with that, when he sold it, he said, "Here, Dick, here's $75 to go for your aviation flying lessons." So he was very instrumental in helping Brother Richard Dick to get started in that area.
Okay. When they left, so first brother is gone, second brother leaves. Do they make careers of the military?
Bob ended up very successful. He was chief motor machinist mate, and he taught at the diesel mechanics school in Cleveland, Ohio. And they closed the school down and transferred it to the Navy base south of Milwaukee, north of Chicago, I think in Waukegan, Illinois. And he fell in love with a school teacher back there, and she didn't want to be married to any Navy man. He loved the Navy, and so he got out of the service and went to watchmaking school. And he ended up working in the space industry, and his last big project was a cesium ion engine that is beyond the scope. It's been flying for 30 years, so it's really out there now. And it's a micro thruster because it uses ions to thrust.
When you say out there, you mean like
Way in space.
Okay.
Beyond the Milky Way.
That is out there.
Yeah.
So he did not make a career of it. He did stay for more than his original term, but he...
Yeah, he was in for about 7 years.
Okay. And Dick?
Richard was graduating, got his wings, and the war was over, and all his friends were getting out to go to the airlines because that was going to be a big deal. He got out, and there were no jobs with the airlines because he didn't have enough flying hours. So he ended up going to school at the University of USC at one of their extension schools in Santa Maria, California. And while he was there, he ended up and graduated and went to work. There wasn't much opportunity at that time either. He went to work on the Los Angeles Police Department and transferred over to the fire department and went back to a conference at Purdue University, and they were so impressed with him, they hired him as an instructor there.
To teach?
To teach.
To teach what?
Safety.
Okay.
All aspects of safety as a fire department.
All right, that sounds
And
awesome.
Then he got called by Flying Tigers that they needed help, so he flew in the dew line on the C-46s that were used to supply the Chinese nationalists from India flying the hump called the C-46.
Have you ever flown a C-46?
No, seen pictures of it, and his biggest comment was one of the navigators, and this was during the era that they were supporting the dew line. It was being built and that was the radar up in Canada and Alaska in that era, that he ended up needing an airplane, and they transferred from one airplane to another airplane. And the navigator said, I don't have a seatbelt in my station. It's not safe. And the captain who was flying said, this whole operation is not safe. Those were the conditions that they were flying in those days, which weren't very good.
Did you get to visit your brothers when you were younger, as they were grown men and had their own homes and stuff like that?
Well, as far as visiting them, I can remember going with my mother to visit my brother Bob, and they were living in Burbank, California, in a house trailer, and it was very tight and very confined. And as far as any advice on what to do, didn't receive any. And as far as visiting, Brother Dick, he more or less came home to visit us. And I can remember one of the big things that was like Christmas in July was he sent a footlocker full of his military clothes that he got home and he had collected at these various stores. And in the winter I broke into that footlocker and I used his fur-lined jacket and fur-lined boots to deliver newspapers on my route when the snow was about 4 feet deep. That was in Spokane, Washington.
That is pretty cool.
It was cold, not cool.
Well, it's cool that you got to use his gear instead of nothing, or the alternative stuff. So were you able to keep up the best friend relationship with your brothers throughout?
Pretty much. It's something that sticks with you, that they're always very supportive. And that's true with everything in life, that people you contact with, they are very positive on helping you. And a lot of times those individuals you can never pay back. All you can do is try to pass it on to another individual in your life.
Did you guys ever have any healthy competition?
No, the only thing I can remember as far as competition, there was never any running or anything. It was always observing, because Bob and my dad were building pleasure boats in their spare time when there wasn't any work on the dam. And I can remember them building a speedboat where they put lap siding on it, and to steam the planks, they built a steam box. It was about 16 feet long, and on the end of it, and the steam box floated or was slanted uphill, and they put a big wash tub underneath it. They kind of shielded around it, and they built a big bonfire on it. And so the water would boil and the steam would come off, and it'd make the plank very hot. And then they'd take this hot steam plank, which was very pliable now, and they'd clamp it on and screw it onto the side of the boat. And it took probably 20 or more pieces of good, strong wood to do that. And as a little boy, it was fascinating. And then they built a hydroplane boat. And as far as games, my brother, it was a sandy lot, so you'd play a little handball, and he wanted to teach me some gymnastics. And he had a hard time trying to teach me that, because the first try I had, it's where he's on his back and he's the receiver, and he's laying on the sandy bar, and he wants me to run at him, put my hands on his knees. He'll grab my shoulders and flip me over. First time he did this, I came flat down on my face and I was eating sand, and I was not happy. So it took him a little while to coax me to do it again, and it was successful. So I passed that on to some of my friends.
Okay. When did you join the military?
The military was interesting, because now it goes back to, remember I asked you a question, I said, gee, you're left-handed. Did that ever handicap you? And then I told you about my friend, and his name is Roland Carmen. and he was 2 years older than I was. And Roland was in the same grade I was, but he was 2 years older. Now, this was a period of time, 1949, and they had heard that the 116th Fighter Squadron, which was an Air National Guard unit in Spokane, Washington, at that time based at Fort George Wright, was recruiting individuals to come in. And so he and one of his other friends that were 17 went in, and they joined up. And he came back and he says, "Hey, Larry, why don't you join the Air National Guard?" And I said, "Gee, what are the requirements?" And he said, "Well, you have to be 17. And I said, "I'm only 15. And he says, "That's okay. Just go in and tell them 17, you're big, they'll believe you. Not only that, nobody wants to join, so they'll take you." So that's what happened, and that started my military career.
So you started at 15.
Yeah,
And how long was your contract for the Air Guard?
it was a 3-year contract.
What were there any benefits offered at that time?
Oh, the benefits were great. You got a free uniform. You were taught how to shine your shoes and how to crease your shirt and everything. And not only that, but they paid you. And that was more than you got in the Boy Scouts.
How much did they pay you? Do you recall?
I think it was $13 a pay session.
And you worked 2 days a month, or was it more?
Yeah, it's just a weekend a month.
$13. Was that good pay back then?
Oh, that was great, because on a paper route, you only made about $4 a week.
Okay.
And you had to do it 7 days a week.
How, what was your job?
Well, the first job I had was working as a understudy for a clerk typist. And we would go out and to the general public to inform them of what was going on the Nevada test site. We had the original films that they produced on the housing units there. One was built of brick, one was built of clapboard, and the other was built of the California typical stucco house, which the stucco is put over wire and what have you. And then the soldiers were in a trench, and then the film would show the blast and the pictures of everything blowing, and it would show the brick house became a pile of bricks, the clapboard house became a pile of scrap wood, but the stucco house, the roof blew off, the windows blew off, but the walls stayed up. So it said, "Gee, if you got to have a house, you build it out of stucco because it's a lot more durable in an atomic blast." So that's the lesson I got out of that. And the sergeant that I worked with, I think they knew that I was young, so they just tried to give me things that would enhance my education.
Did you have to go to basic training?
No, this was not in that era, but you did have to go to summer camp. Now, the first summer camp, as a young person, you end up knowing that you have to do certain tasks. One of them is KP. So the first task I got in KP was operating and working in the kitchen, washing these huge pots and pans. Now, these huge pots and pans were big. So I'd finish pot and pan, and I had all of them finished. And the first sergeant in charge of the kitchen came through, and he wiped one of the pans, and it still had grease in it. And he showed me that, and he said, "You see that grease, son?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "That'll give the whole camp diarrhea." And he said, "You're in charge of the potatoes now." So I ended up peeling potatoes. And that was in Walla Walla, Washington in 1950.
How often did you have to do KP when you were in summer camp?
Every day. It was a permanent assignment for me.
As punishment for not cleaning the pots and pans, or just
No,
everybody?
it was just the jobs that they doled out, and I wasn't skilled in anything, so they put me in the kitchen.
Okay. Okay. How summer camp lasted the entire summer, I assume.
14 days,
Oh, okay. Okay.
which
Um,
is typical of what summer camps are with the military today, I think, also.
the Air Guard is so different than the reserves or okay. Um, after your commitment was over, you were about 18, I assume.
Well, it really is interesting because the Korean War had broken out and the Chinese had invaded. I had 1 year to go. I was 17 years old by this time. So I fessed up and I said, I am only 17, and I told a little white lie to get enlistment. And they said, okay, we'll give you a discharge then. So at that point, my interest was more in the Naval Reserve, so I went from being in the Air National Guard to the Navy Reserve. And that was my next move. And in the Navy Reserve, it was clean, clean, clean. So one of my jobs was running the big buffer so that the floors would shine like like a mirror. And then we'd watch all these horror movies on guillotine amputations and different things because I was leaning toward the medical area. So it was fascinating. And that led into a point that when I was graduating from high school, I received a appointment or to go to full scholarship to the University of Washington on NROTC, the Navy Reserve Officer Training Program. But I turned that down and went to Gonzaga instead. And while at Gonzaga, somebody got me motivated to look into a program that the Marines had called Marine Corps PLC program, Platoon Leaders Class. So I went from the Navy to the Marines, went back, and at this time my brother Richard now was teaching at Purdue University, and he says, what the H have you done? You don't want to do that. Do you want to be a flyer? And I said, wow, that's pretty strong language. He said, you don't want to be in the mud and in the trenches and that sort of thing. He said, think about it, and I'll take you to the guard unit down here, which was the Red Racers, I think, at Indianapolis, at Bear Field, Weircook or something. And he showed me there, and he said, they've got a program. If you go back into the Air National Guard, they'll send you through pilot training. And I said, wow, okay. So I get back home after my stint with the Marine Corps PLC in the jungles of around Quantico, fighting the mosquitoes and the insects and the chiggers, and of course the DIs, which were incessant on driving you to run around the parade ground carrying a pole for no reason at all except for their amusement. And so you end up leaving there, and I went back to my brother Richard's to be with him for a while, and I briefly enrolled at the Purdue University in chemistry, which was my major at the time. And I determined that working on a bread truck, getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning to help deliver bread all over the country, and then trying to go to school was going to be impossible. So brother Richard bought me a ticket on Northwest Airlines back to Spokane, and I re-entered the program at Gonzaga University and got my old job back with the Hoover vacuum cleaner company, repairing them, which I could do at night, and re-enlisted in the Air National Guard, only to be told that I'd have to wait in line. So at that point, I went down to the Air Force recruiter, and he was happy to see me because I walked in and I had good grades, and I passed their Stay-9 test, as it was called at that time, and they sent me off to Park Air Force Base, which is now the prison called Santa Rita, near Livermore, California, for my medical and psychological test. And I returned home and I had orders to go to navigator training, which was the only thing open at that time, because as a navigator, you only had to be smart. You didn't have to have 2 years of college. And then they changed that after I got my orders to nav training, that you only had to, for a pilot, because they were short on pilots, because none of the pilots that had flown in that World War II era wanted to go back and be subject to the hostilities that were going on in Korea with the Chinese and the North Koreans and all that was going on. So they had a big influx of resignations, so they needed pilots. So they changed the rules back to become a pilot, all you needed was a high school education, and you had to have a certain State Corps score, which I did. And so I had written a letter to the same the colonel that had issued the orders, and he reassigned me to a pilot class. And that opened up the world of aviation for me and really opened up my life.
So it took a State 9. Is that the equivalent of today's ASVAB? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
It just was picking your brain to see if you could figure out how gears and clogs and how your math was and that sort of thing.
When did you finish school?
Which school?
I want to say probably your AA or this.
Well, I never finished that. It took me, and we'll walk through it. Took me about 6 or 7 colleges before I finally got my Bachelor of Science degree.
Okay. To go back to aviation school, or you sent a letter to your colonel, and then you got into pilot school. What was pilot school like?
Well, first of all, you had to go through an indoctrination called pre-flight.
Mm-hmm.
And you get a ticket on an airplane that puts you on a DC-3 on United Airlines to Denver. You get to Denver, and then you have about a 2-hour wait, and then you pick up an airline called Braniff Airlines and another DC-3, and you fly down to San Antonio, Texas. By that time, you get there about 9 o'clock at night, and you're greeted by signs that say, aviation cadets this way. So you go out there and you're greeted with a friendly greet of stand here, do this, do that, and you realize that it's not going to be very friendly. Well, they take you out to Lackland Air Force Base. You get the standard haircut, which is not very becoming. And by the time you get in bed, it's 4 or 5 in the morning. And all of a sudden, people start yelling at you at 6 o'clock to get out, get up, get going and do your thing. So that's the start. And then the first 6 weeks, you're an underclassman, and you're governed by the rules of the upper class. And that all changes dramatically when they leave. They get their orders. So now you become the upper class and the ruling class for what goes on. And then you graduate from that, and you get assigned to your, what they call primary flying school, which could be in Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Missouri, Texas, or Arizona. And I lucked out because my orders said you're due to report into Marana, Arizona, which is outside of Tucson and south of Phoenix, which was a plum assignment. Very excited about that. I reported in there, and you get the check-in sequence, and you finish that, and then you report to the flight line for flying. Now, half the day is academics, and half the day is flying. So I'm standing there, and we're assigned different instructors. My instructor is a World War II crew chief that had used his GI Bill to become a pilot and an instructor, and his name is Smitty. And I'm assigned to Smitty, as are 2 others, but these 2 others had gone through ROTC and were already commissioned, and they were second lieutenants. So there are 3 of us, And Smitty zeroes in on me and he says, "Cadet Otto, do you like acrobatics?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I love acrobatics," because you got to be positive about everything. Well, the acrobatics that I'd been exposed to are in the movie, in Lafayette Escadrille and Hell's Angels, and it looks like they're having a great time flying and doing all these things. So he is so proud, and we crawl into this brand new Beechcraft T-34 Mentor, it's called. And it's shiny and it's new, and it's got the trainee is in the front seat and the instructor's in the back seat, and it's got this sliding canopy that's open, and now it's May and it's very hot and it's in the afternoon, so you fly with the canopy open. Now the clothes you're issued, you've got a flight suit, which I still love today, to wear a flight suit, and in those days they issued the most beautiful white goatskin gloves that you could wear, because it added to the dexterity. Rather than your hands sweating on the controls and stuff, it kind of dissipated that, even when they were full of sweat and wet. And so the next sequence, he starts showing me these various acrobatic maneuvers. Now my stomach is not the strongest in the world, so I'm getting greener and greener. And then he says, "I want to show you an Immelman turn with a snap on the top." So he does this Immelman turn, which pulls down, then you pull about 4 G's coming up, and then right over the top, you're almost weightless, and he snaps it like that. And that did it. I just couldn't handle it anymore, and I didn't want to, and there was no bag in the cockpit to go in. So I caught it in my hands and threw it overboard. And guess what happened? The airstream came around with that and right on his Ray-Bans. And that almost ended my career, because he called emergency and the medics met us, and they took me off, and I had to talk to the flight surgeon. And he says, "If that happens one more time, we have to wash you out." And I said, "Oh, okay." So thereafter, I learned to either swallow it or do maneuvers that wouldn't cause it. So that's called gutting it out.
Did other pilots have the same issue?
Oh, I'm sure they did, but it wasn't things you talked about or bragged about it at beer call.
Okay, because there's a name for it, I imagine that it's something that happens.
Well, a famous pilot had the same thing, and he was probably classified as the best acrobatic pilot, or one of the best by Chuck Yeager or anybody else, and that was Bob Hoover, who was a great performer in the air and on the ground.
Did you know them personally, either of
Bob
those?
Hoover, yes.
Okay.
I had first met him when I was based at Holloman Air Force Base, and he was performing with a P-51 at Kirtland Air Force Base, and I had met him then.
Okay. So you made it through that. You didn't get washed out.
Well, that's just primary flight training.
Then there's secondary, I take it?
Yeah, there's a basic. You got primary and basic. So basic, I was very lucky, because some of my friends ended up going to multi-engine school and different schools, and I got assigned to Williams Air Force Base, which is a fighter pilot school, to learn how to fly the T-33 and again the T-28. At Marana, we flew the T-34 and the T-28 Alpha, and then we went to Williams Field to fly the T-28 Alpha and the T-33. Now, driving in the front gate of Williams to report in, I looked up and here was this beautiful 4-ship formation of T-33s that were really tucked in there. 1 and 2 were here, and 3 and 4 were over here, and they went into the break. Now the break is where they come in and they pitch out this way. So there's supposed to be an echelon this way. Well, the number 3 guy breaks into the number 2 guy, and the number 2 guy breaks into the number 1 guy, and 4 people are killed, the instructor too. Number 4 is left out here, who is a student that they had to talk in. And my thoughts on that was, gee, flying these jet aircraft is going to be dangerous. That was my impression.
I see you made it safely.
Yeah,
Good job.
yeah, so far.
Are you still flying?
Not now, I'm 86. I stopped active flying when I was 83.
Okay. When you were 83, what were you flying at 83?
Well, I received, because somebody thought enough of me to appoint me what is called FAA designated engineering representative as a test pilot. So what I was flying at that time was an extra tank modification that was going into a multi-million-dollar executive 737 that belonged to the Canadian outfit that owned Canadian gas and diamonds and everything else. So it was pretty exquisite. They had bought this airplane from some Saudi prince, and in the back had a bathroom and a shower and a queen-size bed, and the televisions were always oriented so that it showed which way Mecca was, so that when they prayed 5 times a day, they know which way to put their prayer rug.
Wow.
And that was pretty calm, really. So it wasn't any big deal to me, but there was a lot more fun in that. You know what I call the difference between the dates is the dash. You got the birth date, and you got the death date, and you got the line in between. So we're still on that line in between, and that's called the and I've forgotten what I called that line. Anyway,
We'll come back to it.
yeah.
Okay. So what year is it when you finish basic?
Yeah,
What year is it?
that was 1955, and we received our commission on April 29th of 1955.
Okay. So after that you go to your first duty station?
You actually go to advanced training then,
What?
or your duty assignment. So they put a lot of time and money into training you. So my duty assignment was to be an instructor in Big Springs, Texas, in the T-33, teaching young students to make me sick. And that's the last thing I wanted to do. So I talked to my friend who is still alive today, Richard P. Smith, who was 4 years older than I was, and he had spent 4 years in the Navy, and Richard was going to helicopters. And Richard said to me, helicopters are the wave of the future. The Air Force is going to have thousands of those, and you'll really enjoy flying them. I said, what's a helicopter? And he says, well, you've driven a motorcycle before. He said, it's got a throttle on one of the controls, and it's got a stick rather than a horns that you fly. And he said, I think you really enjoy it. I said, okay. So I took that other assignment, and that sent me to Gary Air Force Base near San Marcos, Texas, which Lyndon Johnson graduated from the college there on San Marcos Junior College. And so I graduated from that. And the wonderful thing about a helicopter, it really makes you aware of what's going on. You fly these jet aircraft and you've got your helmet on and your oxygen mask, and you can barely see outside over the rails, and you're kind of embedded in this protective box. Now you're in a helicopter, the doors are off, and it's like the helicopter in MASH. It's an H-13, and you've got all this visibility, you can see everything, and it's kind of scary. And it's different to fly because if you try to treat it like you're in a jet, you'll over-control it. So you have to think a little slower. But before you even do that, you have to be taught of what are the critical parts on this thing. And not only does the mechanic or the crew chief look it over, but you look it over because it's going to be your life if things aren't right. So you check the bearings to make sure that the bearings are tight enough, and the tail rotor is attached and it hasn't been damaged, and the rotor blades haven't got any nicks on it for somebody getting too close to trees. And you got to make sure if you're flying it solo, the battery has to be in the tail. So you have to physically move this battery to the tail because it'll be unbalanced because the center of gravity is so critical in that. So you learn that, and what you do is you learn about engine failures, and you learn about a thing called auto-rotation. Now, if you lose an engine on a helicopter, what you're doing is you're trading, you've got potential energy because of the height the helicopter is up here, and you trade that potential energy for kinetic energy in the rotor system. So you let the potential energy transfer into kinetic energy in the rotor system so that when you come down, you trade this kinetic energy into stopping so you don't hit the ground hard and wreck the helicopter or yourself. So you finish that phase and you go into the bigger helicopter. You went from a Bell H-13 to a Sikorsky H-19. Now this is one where the engine is in front of you and you're sitting up high, about 6 feet in the air, and you're looking down over it. Now it's about 3 times the gross weight, and it supposedly will do all these different things. Now it's getting very hot in Texas in the summer, and you realize the limitations of a helicopter are such that it has a special thing that occurs as you speed the helicopter up. You may not be able to get off the ground and hover initially because you're too heavy, but if you skip along the ground and get it going at about 20 miles an hour, a thing occurs where initially the rotor blades are sucking the air down through the top, and it creates kind of a little tornado that you're trying to fly in. And it's when you get out of this vortex at about 20 miles an hour, the blades now are operating very efficiently, and they don't have to have such a high angle of attack that now you've actually increased your ability to fly. So you fly out of that. And in this one, you're allowed to go on these long cross countries between the various cities in the country. Well, what's really important is not the cities that are in between there, but where you can auto-rotate this thing in case the engine failures. And so you really look for where you can land. Now in an auto-rotation, the descent rate of a helicopter is about 45 degrees. So you've really got to be quick in doing this. And later on that saved me a number of times of doing that. So from there, you get an assignment to your squadron you're being assigned to. And I'm being assigned to this squadron which is going to have a wing of H-21s. Over 300 helicopters are supposed to be coming. And that's in Seward Air Force Base, Tennessee, outside of Smyrna, Tennessee. And we arrived there, and guess what? The Army and the Air Force have got together because the Army was getting into too many fixed-wing airplanes, and the Air Force was getting into too many helicopters. So the Army took over the helicopter assault rotary wing mission, and the Air Force took over the transport mission and got all the DC-3s and stuff that the Army had, and they were restricted to small twin-engine aircraft that they still are today. And so I was out of a job. The base was closing, So I went to the personnel officer and I said, I'd like to go to Europe. So he put me down into that this man wants to go to Europe. And I got an assignment. It said to Denmark. And I was excited because Denmark, and you look at Copenhagen and that beautiful statue when you come in there of the maiden that's sitting there in the entrance to the harbor. Then I get the official orders that come down, and it says Thule, Greenland. And I said, Thule, Greenland? You got to be kidding. I thought I was going to Denmark. So I went back to the personnel officer, and I said, you said I was going to Denmark. And he says, Thule, Greenland is a county of Denmark. Look it up. And get on that bus up to the embarkation port in New York.
I have a few questions. Did helicopter failures happen often?
Yes.
Why do you suppose that is?
Well, helicopters are under a lot of stress.
Okay.
Because basically they're trying to tear themselves apart because the rotating system is under a lot of strain. And if the manufacturer that is certified to build the helicopter gets defective parts from some of the subcontractors, then you end up with failures. And the engine sometimes would fail quite often. While I was there, they had an H-21 that was brand new that was coming out of the Piasecki factory in Philadelphia that crashed and killed the whole crew.
Would you say that helicopters have since improved? Are you aware of these? Okay.
Tremendously. With the advent of the turbine engine was the big step forward in helicopters.
What did the military use helicopters for back then?
Well, it was in its infancy, and of course some started in Korea. During the Korean War, they used the Bell H-13, which the movie MASH, or the TV series MASH, is famous for. So it was used for observation, medical evacuation, very limited because it would only carry one. And then the H-19 came in and they could carry up to 6 personnel with their gear and deploy them in various areas, and that was used in the inception of the assault rotary wing, which wasn't coming on board fully until the Army got into it.
All right, thank you for answering those questions. So you get on a bus, you head to New York, you're off to Denmark.
Not yet.
Wait.
You got to report in.
Okay.
So you report into this place in New York, and they say, okay, you've got to go down to McGuire Air Force Base and report into the transportation officer, who will schedule you for a flight to depart to Thule, Greenland. Now, the scheduling transportation officer, you arrive and you report in there, and he gives you billeting, so you go over and you get arranged, and he says to you, you report in for the flight, and you say, oh, the weather at this time of year, and this is January, in Thule, Greenland, and Newfoundland, and Labrador is terrible. There's blizzards go on, we've got airplanes that are stuck up there, and we haven't got anything that's due to depart for 3 days. So you might as well go to New York City, excuse me, and have a good time. Excuse me, let me take a little break here.
Yes, sir.
And so my brother Richard was there. He'd left Purdue University and Flying Tigers, and now he was employed by Pan American going through new hire training. And he lived not far from LaGuardia Airport, called Jackson Heights. So I hopped on the bus and went to the 42nd Street bus station, transferred to a bus going to College Point, and met my brother. Now these are new hires, so he's living with 3 others in a rented apartment. So I go there, and he's very happy to see me, and he's saying, you know, just stay in the military because it's a lot better than what's going on in the civilian world, and it's paying a lot better than what I'm getting as a new hire. So I'm there, and he says, oh, by the way, we're having a little get-together tonight. 3 doors down are these stewardesses, as they called them in those days, but today they call them a flight attendant. And they're coming over, and we're having potluck. They're bringing a salad and something else, and we're cooking hot dogs. And tonight is the showing of Mary Martin in Peter Pan on television. Now, they had a TV. The girls didn't have a TV. It was black and white, but that was a big deal. So I said, great. So in bounces these girls. One of them is really kind of neat because she's kind of, in some ways, she was kind of pushy because another girl had arrived and was watching a soap opera. And she said, and went over and changed channels and said, I didn't come here to watch a soap opera. I want to see Mary Martin. And guess who that was? My wife, to be, Vlasta Otto, or as she was called then, Vlasta Vrani Otto. So I reluctantly went back to McGuire, getting ready to go to Thule, Greenland. And I got back there, and the transportation officer said, where have you been? And I said, I've been in the city. He said, well, the weather opened up, and we sent an airplane out, but you weren't here. And I said, oh, darn, too bad. And I said, okay, when's the next one? He said, oh, weather closed up again, and it's going to be at least 3 or 4 days because this is really forecast to be severe. So I turned around, and I caught the bus back to the city and my brother's house, and I started actively dating this young lady. And I went back, and the transportation officer says, that's twice. You missed the bus. You missed the airplane. And now, you better catch the next one. But it won't leave for 3 days. So I did the same thing, and I got back, and I missed it 3rd time. And he said to me, you're lucky. I was going to give you an Article 15, but where you're going is a hell of a lot worse than an Article 15. He said, that airplane is ready to go. Get on it. So I reported into my squadron in Thule, Greenland, which was a rescue squadron, 55, it was the 55th Air Rescue Squadron, located in Thule, which is very desolate. So that started my 1-year isolation in Thule, Greenland, which ended up being fascinating in a number of ways. And my letter writing increased to at least 1 letter a day. And you can imagine where those letters went.
I have a few questions about your future wife. So she comes over. Do you instantly know that that's going to be your wife after she's a little pushy?
Oh, absolutely. I said, she's got a positive attitude.
Okay. And does she reciprocate that same instant feeling, or did it take her a few days?
Well, I think it took her a few days, like 2 years, to make up her mind, but mine was made up then, and luckily so. And
you guys, so it was about a week that you, about 7 or 8 days,
yeah,
that you were able to stay and visit with her and see her. Was she not flying at that time? If she
well,
was,
she'd get called out once in a while,
okay,
and which she was on a reserve a lot in New York.
What rank were you at that time?
Pardon?
What rank?
Oh, I was a 2nd lieutenant, a brown bar.
And what year was it? Was it about 60s?
1956.
Oh, so it was still, okay. Okay. So you do your year, you're doing a lot of letter writing. You come back to where?
Well, in Thule, Greenland, it was an interesting tour because, number one, it's very severe condition. and any snow that comes in blizzard form, comes in horizontal, which blows off the ice cap, the Greenland ice cap. And you're checked out up there in the weather conditions in the helicopter you're flying, and you try to participate in any other flying that becomes available there. And you end up flying in the fur jacket that's got the wolverine and the hair sticking out because it's so cold. And the helicopter is so cold, the controls sometimes would freeze. And landing in snowy conditions with a helicopter is rather dangerous because it's kicking up its own dust storm, which makes it very difficult to land. So you have to come in almost with forward motion and then put it down quickly before you lose contact with the ground. Now, while I was there, they lost 3 or 4 aircraft due to the weather conditions and trying to land in adverse or poor weather conditions. So by the time I was ready to leave there, a crash had occurred just prior to Christmas. And the commanding general of the Air Rescue Service came up there to do an investigation. And he was not a happy camper because the week before he had just married a Pan American purser. And he didn't want to leave, but he was ordered to go up there and investigate this squadron. And his reaction was, what's going on up here? And I was the only one that hadn't been involved in an accident. And he asked for my advice, and I gave him my advice, and he said, no, that's not it. It's supervisory error, and we're going to replace the commander. And I said, okay, you must be right.
What was your advice?
My advice was, this assignment is somewhat of a punishment colony for those that are alcoholics or have screwed up. And he said, how'd you screw up? And I said, I didn't know my geography.
Did you find out did changing the command help that situation at all?
No, it was the same thing.
I imagine so, but I had to ask.
Sure.
Okay. What happens next?
What happens next is I get an assignment back to the States, and I picked up a pretty good assignment, and it turned out to be Perrin Air Force Base, and the assignment was local base rescue. So passing through New York, I stop and visit a while and try to put some positive spin on everything and head off to Texas. And I arrive down there and get checked out and do a lot of things and watch tornadoes dance around the base and different things like that, and end up with a great experience there, because at local base rescue there's small colleges and you can continue your college education, which I had continued at Thule. I had taken courses from the University of Maryland on the extension program they had there. And when I was based in Tennessee, I had also taken some from the University of Tennessee. And so while I was at Perrin, I enrolled in classes at Austin College in Sherman, Texas, and also in Durant, Oklahoma, which was just across the border, to continue my degree. And this was 1957, 58 time period.
How long was your stay at that base in Texas?
Well, that base in Texas was interesting because I had working in local base rescue. You're flying the helicopters that they have at that time. And you're also allowed to fly the jet aircraft and the multi-engine aircraft. So we end up at one time, I fly with my friend Major John Steen to New York, and I'm carrying an engagement ring. And we land at Floyd Bennett Airport, which is a naval air station not far from JFK. And I take a cab over to where my my girlfriend and I is staying, and she's staying at this time with her sister, who lives in College Point, near LaGuardia Airport, and I propose and she accepts. So I'm on a real high note. This B-25 has got special memories for me, not only from the Jimmy Doolittle raid, but from the fact that it transported me up there to get engaged.
Were there a lot of rescues at that base?
She was with United Airlines.
No.
Pardon?
Were there a lot of rescues at the base in Texas?
Well, you were trained for local base rescue, and a lot of the human factors design that went into aircraft weren't very good at that time. So we had a lot of off-base crashes that would occur, that as the fighter pilot was taking off in his F-86, and he was have to change radio frequencies, he had to reach back this way to change the radio frequencies, and when he did that, the airplane became unstable, and when he looked at his instruments, he didn't interpret them right, and he crashed. And so the local base rescue couldn't do much for that, as far as, because all you'd find is pieces and debris, and that's originally why they took the footprint of fighter pilots, was because that's often all that was left was his boots with his feet in them. So it was kind of, and then those helicopters were, I had one scramble one night where a pilot had ejected in Oklahoma, and it was reported where he was. So I took off, and it's about 2 o'clock in the morning in the H-19 helicopter, and I see this flare in the middle of a field that's surrounded by a lot of trees and stuff, and that's the fighter pilot that had ejected that night. So wanting to rescue him, I took a pass with a helicopter and tried to use the landing lights, which were very inadequate, and then I climbed up to about 500 feet above that, and we had what they called parachute flares. So I took the helicopter and I instructed the crew chief to launch the flare when I had the helicopter in a 45-degree bank, so he launched it so it wouldn't go into the rotor blades and shoot us down high up. And when the parachute flare, which was made, and it really lighted up the whole thing. So I auto-rotated the helicopter down into this grass field, and the grass was high, so it was up above the belly of the helicopter where the landing lights are, and we loaded up the pilot that had ejected and his parachute in there, and then with the crew chief's help and aid, I backed the helicopter to the back of this clearing so that we could have as much clearing to clear the trees at the end. And so to take off now, it's really, really dark, and you have to trust your instruments and your instincts and your inability to make a judgment because you haven't been around all these experiences that much. And so you go roaring down with the landing lights that are pointed at the grass, at the ground, looking at the instruments, and the main thing you're looking is to get through translational lift and get about 60 knots. I pull up, and as I pull up, I see the trees just disappearing underneath the helicopter, and we climb out and we go back. And as I'm flying, I say to myself, that pilot doesn't know how lucky he is to make it out of there tonight, and me too. That was one of the instances. Another one was I had gone down to a local airport. Somebody had bailed out and the airplane had crashed, but he was okay and he was waiting there to get picked up. And in the H-19, you have the main strong structural gear in the back, and you have these two little gear in the front. And taxiing out, the helicopter lurches a little bit to the left, and I didn't think anything of that because the exhaust heats up that strut on that side of the airplane. So we get down there and we touch down and land, and the helicopter lurches to the left, and the crew chief says, "Hey, let me check that." So he gets out and he says, "That strut is broken. It's been damaged." And he says, "Shut it down." I said, "We're not going to shut it down here. We're going to pick up the pilot and his parachute, and we're going to fly back to Parent." And we flew back there, and I dropped the pilot off, and then I had maintenance get a metal horse saw, and I landed the helicopter with the bad gear on that stand and took care of it that way, and then shut the helicopter down. Now, maintenance was so good that they didn't want to charge me with an accident, but the accident had really occurred prior, and my friend had done a lot of practice auto rotations, and he'd hit down too hard and broken a cast magnesium fitting that this gear leg fit into, and hadn't said anything about it.
Good for you.
Pardon?
Good for you. And being able to still complete the mission with the current disability of the
Aircraft.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty amazing. Thank you for sharing those stories.
You're welcome. Got a lot of them.
So you get engaged. She says yes. What is the next plan for you and her?
Well, the next plan for her and myself is she arrives in Texas. Now, at that time, she had to quit her job because if you're married, you can't be a stewardess because you could get pregnant. And the thinking at that time was, if in an emergency you have a flight attendant or a stewardess, as it's called then, they would worry too much about their own self and family, and they wouldn't take care of the paying passengers as well in an emergency. They'd think of, oh, I've got to save myself for my children. So that was the man's type thinking in that era. So what were we doing? Well, we get there, we drive down in my wife's car with the wedding gifts and stuff, and I arrive on base, and the housing unit that I had been issued was taken over by somebody more senior than I was, so we had no place to stay. So a friend of ours, who I'd flown with, offered us his spare bedroom, so we stayed in that, and we found a little house that we could clean up and rent and paint, and so we're in the process of painting. Meanwhile, my wife's pregnant while she's painting, and we want to move the kitchen stove to paint behind it. We move the kitchen stove, and it's got at least an inch of mouse droppings under it. And she said, "That's it, we're not staying here." And at that time, base housing opened up. Now, I continued on. Well, my wife is doing her thing, I'm doing my studying and continuing. And then opportunities open up again, much like happened during the Korean War. Because of the threat, I got to go through pilot training. And now Sputnik goes up in 1958. And the Air Force and the country is scared because the Russians, the Soviet Union is ahead of us. And that's not good news. So the emphasis that came from General Schriever at that time was, we've got to open up and get higher education in our military. And to do this, we're going to open up programs called the Air Force Institute of Technology. But what you needed was 2 years of college. Well, by that time I had finished 2 years of college by going through these various correspondence courses. And so on your wish sheet, they put down, what colleges would you like to attend to get your aeronautical engineering degree? And I said, oh, University of Colorado, University of Arizona, University of Washington. Guess what? I got Texas A&M. And I said, okay, that's great. We'll go down to Texas A&M, which we did. And we drove down there and got settled in a nice rental house, and I got settled in school. And the next step, I had to get my base to do my flying hours out of. Well, Waco had James Conley, and it was a target towing job that we got to do up there, but we'd often go up there and they'd cancel our flight. Well, you'd lose a whole day of school, and that's very critical when you're trying to keep up in higher math and physics and chemistry and all that kind of stuff. So I said, we went over to the Army commissary, which was much better, at Fort Hood, Texas. It's bigger and more appreciative and everything else. And while Vlasta's shopping at the commissary, I note that they've got helicopters there. So I go over and talk to the company commander. Can I get attached to here for flying duty? And he says, sure, just haven't got the orders. So I said, hot dang, I'll do that. So I had my headquarters cut orders attaching me to the 501st Aviation Company in the 1st Armored Division, and they did that for me. So the next time I went up there, I said, okay, here are my orders reporting in, sir. What are we going to do? And he says, come with me. And we hop in a helicopter, and he goes out. I do some auto rotations and flying, and he says, okay, you're clear to go. So I get 4 hours of flying and come back down, and Vlasta's got the car loaded up with groceries. And we head back down. Before we do that, I say, okay, how am I going to arrange the helicopter? And he says, oh, don't worry about that. He said, we'll fly down to Easterwood Airport with 2 helicopters, and I'll have a crew chief for you, and we'll fly the other pilot back. But in the meantime, you're going to have the helicopter and the crew chief, which you have to put up and provide him a room and food. And oh, by the way, here's a green card for gas, and you can keep all the green stamps. So that was the way I worked it. And so for 2 years, I was attached to the Army, and they treated me so well that I was thinking of a inter-service transfer, and Vlasta put her foot down, which probably saved my life, because the Army was starting to really build up with their helicopter assault rotary wing force. And I could see myself in the movie that was done where they had the helicopter and the pilot was called Too Tall.
Okay. Well, the Army isn't a bad branch. I just want to put that out there. I'm happy that we treated you well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you've finished Texas A&M?
Yeah.
Okay.
I expected to get assigned as a aeronautical engineer in the space program or something like that. And guess what? They were short of pilots in the Air Force again. So they activated me on my fighter pilot MOS, and we got assigned to Holloman Air Force Base. And by this time we had 3 girls.
Where's Holloman Air Force?
Holloman is near White Sands, New Mexico, north of El Paso. And so we report in there, and I get checked out, and the drone aircraft, which is the old P-80 Shooting Star, which is now a drone aircraft, which is called a QF-80, and the T-33, which you fly the drone from the back seat of the T-33 through a transmitter, and the guy in the front seat of the T-33 is flying the aircraft and flying formation on the drone that the man in the back seat is flying. So it's kind of different. And then you learn all the aspects of that. You learn how to be a ground controller for that, because the ground controller takes in for the takeoff, he takes the drone off, and then the air controller picks up the drone, and then in landing, the ground controller takes over the control of the drone from the guy in flight. And then you get to fly other kinds of aircraft, like I got flights in F-100, I got checked out in the Convair C-131, and I went over to my friends at the Army, and I got to fly their helicopter, the H-19 there, and also the Beaver. And so I kept the experience in there. And while I was back at Texas A&M, I was interested and invited to go to the Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards. So my friend Ray Ringman, who was out there for an interview, invited me to go with him. So we got in a T-33 at James Conley and flew out to Edwards Air Force Base. And I got an interview there also in the helicopter section. And little did I know that that would come back years later.
How many years later?
Well, I had been at Holloman probably 2 years, and Vlasta was pregnant again, and I had continued my education, and I had orders to go back to Texas A&M to get my master's in aeronautical engineering. I had gone down there. Now Vlasta by this time was 8 months pregnant, and I'm down there just after Christmas, and I said, I don't really belong here. So I tried to contact my people that had issued the orders at Wright-Patterson, and the whole place is closed down for 2 weeks. So I said, based upon what I know, and my commander back at Holloman Air Force Base was sometimes you do VOCO, verbal orders on the officer commanding, and that's me. So I gave myself orders to go back and report into Holloman, which I got back, and 2 weeks later Lawrence was born. And then 2 months later I got orders to go to the Navy Test Pilot School at Patuxent River, Maryland. That was 1960, when was that, 62, 64.
What rank are you now?
Pardon?
What rank are you at this time?
At that time, I'm a captain.
What's test pilot school like?
Test pilot school is like an intense graduate school where you complete 2 years of education in 9 months. But it involves academics and flying various aircraft and writing the reports on how the aircraft performed or the problems with it. And it's a very time-consuming and critical, and what it's really doing is testing your ability to convey and communicate problems between what a pilot sees and what an engineer has to do to correct those problems that the pilot sees.
So you're using your degree and your pilot training and some of what your dad taught you, just all in once, all at the same time. Multitasking at its finest.
Not quite as good as you ladies do, but as good as most guys can do.
All right. Did you enjoy being a test pilot?
Oh yeah. It's not so much being a test pilot, but it puts you with individuals on a common purpose to discover and make something better. So it's the teamwork and the interplay that goes on between the people. It's the great thing about being a test pilot.
Now, I've been dying all interview to ask you this. What is your favorite thing to fly?
The favorite thing to fly is what you're flying at the time.
Oh.
It just...
There's no favorite aircraft. There's nothing that just, I want to fly that forever, or it was just the best ever. Nothing particular.
No.
Okay.
There's some magical airplanes that the 747 is unique in its fact that it's so big, but you land it and it tickles on like a elephant in a ballet. And I found that delightful. The aircraft that I take into the lowest visibility conditions would probably be an Otto land on a 737 or a 767. The last big airplane I did at formal testing was the MD-11, which ended up rather fascinating, and the youngest daughter is a pilot for UPS, and she's flying the airplane that I helped develop. The fun programs were, I worked on the, and you see it in the news quite often, is a DC-10 that's called a 10 tanker that is a water bomber that I helped work on and certify. And some of the more fun experiences with individuals working on a program was with DARPA. And that was a DC-10 that was highly modified that we had to do some odd testing on out of Greenville, South Carolina, where the runway was under construction and it was much shorter than it should have been. So we had to download all the fuel on the airplane, so it was a minimum flight of an hour with no reserves to expand the flight envelope. And to do that, we had to have the airplane with the tug tow us out and put us to where the construction was going on the runway with our tail and the exhaust of the engine facing the rock and the underlayment that was going to be under the concrete when the concrete was poured. And to launch that, you couldn't start the number 2 engine because they have what is called a trailing cone that gives you the sensitive airspeed on the airplane, because the present pitot-static system would be distorted so much by the bulge on the fuselage. And so you'd start engines 1 and 3, and you'd have somebody on the sideline holding this trailing cone, which is attached to the top of the vertical stabilizer. And you'd go shooting by him, and he's wearing his motorcycle leathers and his helmet and stuff, and he throws this in the air, and the trailing cone then swings around and starts flying. Now, once the trailing cone starts flying, you can add the power to the center engine. So we had to all base this on taking off with an engine out, which is an unusual maneuver. But the runway was too short to do that, so we had to count on the thrust coming from the center engine too. Now, if the trailing cone didn't fly and broke off, we had distance, we could abort to take off and stop.
Wow.
And so that airplane was painted all white. And time has passed so that it's not classified. And what happened is we were doing some testing of it out of Los Angeles International Airport. And here's this odd white DC-10 with a big bulge on the side of it. Now, a Delta pilot says, "What kind of airplane is that?" And I said, "It's just a vanilla airplane." And I got in big trouble from DARPA and the security forces, because they said the opposite of vanilla is dark, so it's a dark program. You can't say that.
I'm sorry that you got in trouble, but it would make sense to call it vanilla, maybe even boring, because I think, oh, vanilla, it's boring, right? Like you think of ice cream flavors, it's boring. Are any of your planes over at the Air Force Museum located here in Dayton, Ohio?
Yes, there's a number of the training airplanes I went through, and there's the XC-142 that I was involved in that's there. And the era of that I got involved in was heavily into what they called the vertical takeoff and landing mode, VSTOL. And of those aircraft. There were many. There were the British that came out with the P-1127, which was called the Kestrel. The Germans came out with the DO-31, which was a jet transport, experimental, vertical takeoff. The VJ-101, which was a fighter aircraft. The French came out with a Mirage 3-4, which was a 9-jet, 8 in the fuselage, and 1 for forward thrust. And the United States came out with what they called the Hummingbird by Lockheed, the XB-4B, and then the ducted fan, the XB-5 ducted fan, and then of course there was the X-19 built by Curtiss Wright, and the X-22 built by Bell, and then the XC-142 built by LTV. And then I think that pretty well sums up the American influence on that. The Italians had one, which I can't remember what it was, but of those V-stall aircraft, I lost a number of friends. I lost Bob Rosberg. He was killed in the P-1127 in testing. Best friend, Joe Vasquez, was damaged by a helicopter that slapped him on the head that grounded him for the rest of his life. And then Phil Neal, who was a very gregarious, fun individual to be around, died when the French aircraft, the Mirage 3-4, lost engine power when he was going into land. He successfully ejected, but somebody had actuated a dissing function on the seat such that the parachute never opened and he fell to his death. The XC-142, we lost 3 in Lake Dallas. They were practicing for a maneuver for high-speed rescue of those shot down in Vietnam, and they had a failure of the tail prop on that such that it caused the helicopter, when it was nearing the hover mode, to pitch over on its nose. The 2 pilots ejected, but they into the trees, so they never survived. And the test pilot operating the hoist was killed in the aircraft. There were 5 of those built. Only 1 survived, and that's the one at the museum. On the X-19, which was built by Curtiss Wright, there were 2 of them built. However, 1 had a propeller failure, which the bonding agent between the blades and the spar was bad, and that crashed, and the crew got out of that one. And nobody wants to have the remaining one in any museum, so that shows you the rate of that one. The X-22, there were 2 of them built, and the chief test pilot, Stan Kakel, ended up getting a transmission warning and put it down in a farmer's field that hit fairly hard, so it damaged that one. The second one, I ended up being a project pilot on that back at Patuxent River, and ended up getting to hover it, but never get to fly it. And it ended up and I don't know what museum that one's in, it's not here. Calspan had it for a long time, up and operated out of Buffalo, New York. And the nose section of the one that had crashed was used initially on a C-131 that is housed here, that Calspan has a different nose section on it now. And it's a variable stability aircraft that used to develop probably algorithms that went into the stability augmentation system on the B-1 and the B-2 and the F-117 and Havelo and all those aircraft that can only be flown by fly-by-wire because they're so unstable.
Wow. That's quite a memory.
Mm-hmm.
Do you go and visit some of these planes at the different museums, or you?
Well, I was invited up here by my nephew, Otto, and in coordination with my son Lawrence, they proposed we come up here for a visit. And we had a wonderful tour yesterday with a lot of memories coming back, and it was very, very meaningful to me.
We're happy to have you.
Well, thank you.
Have you visited other planes in other museums?
Oh, to some degree. I've been to the Boeing Museum up in Seattle, and I've been to the Hiller Museum, and I've been to the one in San Diego. And so, yes, I've been around somewhat. The time at Edwards as a test pilot there is interesting because I'm more of the support end of it, in the standpoint that I wasn't one of the spectacular test pilots that went into space or that sort of thing, but I got to do a lot of support. In the H-21, which you have an example in the hangar there, I was lucky enough that I'd get random calls from Chuck Yeager saying that, are you going on a training flight today? And I'd say, sure we are. And he'd say, okay, me and my friend will be there, and we need to be dropped off on this hillside because we're going bird hunting. And I'd say, great. So he would show up at the helicopter with his friend, and his friend happened to be Jimmy Doolittle. And so I'd get to fly Jimmy Doolittle in this contraption that if I was carrying my mother, I don't know whether I'd fly her in that, but they'd hop on there with their bird hunting equipment and stuff and give me a time to pick them up, and we'd fly to where they wanted to get dropped off, and often it wasn't in an area or terrain that was that level, so I'd be touched down with one wheel, let them hop out, and then I'd be assigned a time to come back and pick them up, so I'd continue on with my training mission, come back. Now, that whole story is interesting because it relates to Chuck Yeager. Now, Chuck Yeager had done this earlier, maybe 2 or 3 years prior to that, but he had gone up with a helicopter test pilot by the name of Gene Colvin, and they had flown up to one of the high mountain Sierra Lakes to fish for brown trout, which were virgin trout that were up in there. So Chuck and he take off early one morning, and they fly up and they land in this high mountain lake, and it happens to be the YH-1 Iroquois, which was the forerunner to the UH-1 Huey. But the Air Force was charged with testing it because the Army didn't have the test facility or the pilots to do it at that time. So they land there, and it's in the cool in the morning, and now it heats up in the afternoon, and they've got all these fish they've got up, and they go to take off, and they come to a condition where the helicopter doesn't have enough power to take off, but they take off anyway because they haven't calculated. Gene Colvin hadn't calculated it very good, and they get into settling with power, and they dump the helicopter and themselves in this high mountain lake. Poof. And so they're missing. And I'm not there because this happened 3 years prior to me. So the next sequence, they find them the next morning, and they've lost their fish, but they're alive. And the helicopter's still in that lake up there someplace. And so Yeager gets back, and now he's posted, and he's commander of the Air Force Test Pilot School, and he's still kind of wet behind the ears and angry because of his experience he's had with this helicopter test pilot. So guess what? he makes the arrangement with the Navy Test Pilot School. They can send him a fighter pilot out if he sends them a helicopter pilot to train them in their program back there, because they have a program at the Navy Test Pilot School that'll train helicopter test pilots to really be sharp. So thanks to Chuck Yeager and Gene Colvin, I got sent to the Navy Test Pilot School.
Did you enjoy that?
I did. It was very intense. I'm still very close with a number of my classmates there. One happened to be Orville Wright, but not the original Orville Wright. This is an Orville Wright that grew up in an orphanage in Pennsylvania, and guess what his brother's name was? Wilbur. Now, Orville went into the Navy and became a naval aviator and a helicopter. His brother Wilbur went into the Air Force and became a navigator. Wilbur sadly was killed in a B-52 accident on a training flight. Orville ended up retiring early from the Navy and went to work for IBM in the design of instruments and stuff that went into helicopters and other vehicles. And he writes his memoirs. He's very good at that.
Okay. Have you written a memoir?
No, but I'm chinking away on it because of the prodding that I've got from this program and my son.
Okay. I think we kind of veered away from your career path, so I just want to make sure that we conclude or we finish that. Where did we leave off at?
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, we ended up at Edwards in support of the helicopters that would be used in support of the X-15 when it was launched. Now the X-15, now why do you need a helicopter for that? Well, it's if the X-15 doesn't get any light off when they try to light their rocket engine, it has to have an alternate place to land. And that alternate place is up near Tonopah, Nevada, at a dry lake bed that looks like a mud pie. But when it's dry, what they do is they survey where it would be a good spot to put a runway. And when they've surveyed this area, now with a dry lake bed, it gets a lot of cracks and stuff in it as it dries out. So they have to make sure that on landing on a dry lake bed, that he lands in the right direction. So they take 2 trucks that are loaded with tar type slurry, and they mark the edges of where they want the runway to be. So, and this mud lake is not far from the area that everybody refers to as Area 51, and it's really not the Area 51 where a lot of the spook programs were developed, but this Area 51 test is the new area where they put the runways and stuff that everybody wants to investigate. And as a passenger, you can look out, as you're flying over Tonopah, if you look out to the south, you can see the facilities there. And this is where they tested the F-117 and some other programs that were going on at that time. Now, the dry lake bed is such that when the X-15 lands there, it has to jettison its dorsal fin because that's underneath of where the skids are, and it lands dead stick down there, and you have to support. Now, the pilot on the X-15 is bolted in, so you have to bring the crew that unbolts him and gets him out. You have to bring the flight surgeon with you, and quite often he's very adept and he likes to explore. So there's a lot of dead time because there's delays because of this and that and an experimental program or cancellation. So on these dry lake beds, we and the flight surgeon would always look for the best spot of saying, okay, years ago this was never a dry lake bed, but it was an active lake And if I was a native or Indian traveling, where would I camp? So we'd park the helicopter where we thought he'd camp, and often we'd find trailings of arrowheads that had been worked in that area. So that was the plus of that. And then you'd fly all over these, en route, you'd fly sometimes near Scotty's Castle in Death Valley and other areas that you'd see the trailings of where miners had tried to find their strike, and it never occurred.
Did you end your career in the test piloting arena?
Pardon?
Did you end your career in the test piloting arena?
Not until '83. I had gone from the Air Force. I was actively testing aircraft outside of Bishop, California, and Coyote Flats, and training another test pilot in how to do, how do you obtain what they called the dead man's curve. And it's in a helicopter, dead man's curve means that you're going at a certain speed, at a certain altitude, and if you're inside that, most likely the airplane will crash and you'll get hurt. If you're outside of that dead man's curve, there's a good possibility that with the right skills that you've been trained with, that you'll be able to take that, do a flare and an auto rotation and touch down without any damage to the aircraft or yourself or the personnel inside. And we were up there testing that, and we got outside the curve, and we were getting ready to go do another one, and the crew chief tapped me on the shoulder and he pointed to the rear, and we looked back and the rear ramp was open and the tail was drooping down. So that ended that test. That was the last active test I had in the Air Force. And then I went back to Patuxent River, where I was deployed out of at that time on the X-22 program. And 2 months later, I was on terminal leave, starting a new career at United Airlines as a test pilot.
United Airlines needed a test pilot?
Yeah, they have a test organization, and what that does, it's basically a standard to test the quality of the airplane by the original specs. Will it fly at this altitude? Does the stall system work? Does the overspeed system work? Does the alternate landing gear system work? Does the alternate flap extension system work? And you look at all those things on each test flight that comes out, because an airplane goes through an overhaul at that time every 5 years. Now it's probably up to 7 or 10 years. And at the factory, you don't just turn over a check to buy an airplane, but you make it go through all the specifications to make sure that it meets each one of the specifications that you've paid for. And often it doesn't. It fails on one of those and you require a refly. And on the refly, the manufacturer is not very happy about that. So at that time we were buying aircraft from Douglas and Boeing, and those were the two, and we were also sometimes buying used aircraft on the market.
Well, that makes me feel a little better about flying, I suppose.
Yeah, and as that worked out, I ended up being the manager of flight tests for United Airlines, and I set up a program where we would only hire individuals that are graduate of a test pilot school, because what we were doing at the time, you had to be multitasking, so you could be called upon to fly any one of 6 different types of aircraft in any one of the 3 types of positions that required 3 crew members or more.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So you made it all the way to colonel in the military?
Just lieutenant colonel.
Okay, lieutenant colonel.
Yeah. At that time, I was in the reserves, and I was attached as an MD assignee to the commander of Edwards Air Force Base, who happened to be Tom Stafford, the astronaut, General Tom Stafford. And his classmate going through test pilot school and then the addendum astronaut course was one of my friends and test pilots at United Airlines. His name was Bill Levy, Loewe.
Were you ever in command of airmen or soldiers?
No. The only thing I did was at my job, I worked at the Western headquarters, Western Rescue Control Center at Hamilton Field, and then later when it was moved to McClellan.
Do you have a particular favorite place that you've lived?
Probably in the house that we live in now, that we've lived in 50 years. We bought it temporarily, but little did I know that my wife, when she gets settled in, is reluctant to move. And that's very lucky, because when I went to work for McDonnell Douglas, they offered to buy it and give me a great moving experience. So I went to work with McDonnell Douglas. My wife came down and looked at housing, and she looked at me and said, "You have a job and we have a home. Come and visit as often as you can."
She's so thoughtful.
Yeah, she is.
Okay. Okay. That's funny. I'm sorry.
You're allowed. Good, I'll take a drink.
Are you a part of any, before I get to that question, you have kept a lot of your veteran friends in contact with a lot of people? Is that a
Yes.
true statement?
Yeah.
Do you guys ever get together or?
Just randomly. It's not planned as such. It's more family that gets together. We have a very tight, close-fitting family that all think well, and they're really fun to be around.
Now,
Lots of positive energy.
from what I understand, most of your family have followed in your footsteps?
Only two.
Oh.
2/5. However, two of the other ladies in the family became flight attendants.
Okay, so.
The other one, Vera, who is the principal and teacher that's nearest to us, we taught her how to fly, but she'd rather be around horses than airplanes. She's the one that the psychiatrist would go to examine two children. One, and they'd take a gymnasium and they'd fill it full of toys. And the child would be released in there, and the psychiatrist would be making noise. And then the child would sit amongst all these toys crying because he couldn't find his favorite toy. Uh-oh. And so my daughter is let loose in this gymnasium. It's colored with horse manure all over the floor. And she's as happy as can be, because she says, "There's all this horse manure around here. There's got to be a pony in here someplace."
That's thinking. Did you ever actually go to combat?
No. The closest to combat I was assigned to go to the Nevada test site to hover over Ground Zero as they exploded an atomic bomb underneath me underground. And I did that, what is now Keach Air Base. We flew out of there, and I was assigned to go to the specific location with instrumentation on the helicopter to hover over Ground Zero at a specific altitude, 100 feet, while I detonated this device 3,000 feet below me underground. So I was hovering there, and you'd see the rocks on the hillside shake and then come tumbling down in the dust, and they'd say, okay, successful test. So you'd pull off and you'd look back underneath, and where the device had exploded, the whole chimney effect had shattered all that rock all the way down. So it had made a hole in the ground because it had melted everything below it, and it just fell down. And so you go back and you land, and the scientists are just ecstatic because, one, their device went off, and two, you came back with useful data on all the radiation that evolved out of that hole at that time that it went off. And oh, by the way, can we have your dosimeter? So me and the crew chief would turn over our dosimeter, and we never heard anything, but I was told by my cousin, who was an atomic physicist, you got every kind of radiation you could. It's a good thing that you had your children already. Interestingly enough, that goes back to when I was just enlisted, and I would take those films out on the atomic explosion. Who would know that X number of years later, I'd be hovering over that same ground that the nuclear explosion had done, that evaluated the structures of the brick and the wood and the stucco house.
Wow.
So that was my combat.
That's pretty serious. I think I'd take the combat I went through than that. I do. Okay. Are you a part of any military organizations?
Other than the Reserve Officers Association, which I've been a life member, and the Society of Experimental Test Pilots.
Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed or that should be added to this interview?
Only if you want some more exciting war stories.
Can you tell me your favorite memory or experience in the military? Most magical.
Well, it's probably the camaraderie that you had when you went off-site and you were in control of your own destiny more than you are where you have to ask permission to do something, but you're allowed to make your own command decision at the time. And that was when we'd go up to Bishop, California and do our work up there.
Can you tell me about a truly negative experience that you had?
Yeah, it was 2 near crashes, and that was in the civilian world on the MD-11. We were doing max braking for minimum landing distance at max gross weight on an MD-11, and the pilot I was flying with touched down too hard, and he gave the wrong signal and slammed the nose down so hard that the instantaneous G meter recorded 42 Gs, and it dislocated my shoulder. And I reached around because he was out of phase with it, and it was starting one of these out of phase where he'd slam it down harder and harder and harder, but he was putting the controls in the wrong way, and I reached my arm around and I said, keep the nose in the air. And what had initially happened when it hit, I thought the whole nose section was going to shear off, and then I heard the oral warning system, which is in a woman's voice that says, tire failure, tire failure. And I thought, oh, the battery is still connected. And then we slowed down and brought it in, and that did probably about $15 million worth of damage on that aircraft. And then the other occasion was we were testing for the automatic landing system, which I had been involved heavily in. And the requirement was that the FAA had a requirement that you had to put a signal in. The elevator command would go hard over so that it would push the nose down at about 150 to 200 feet above the ground, and you couldn't recover until you waited 3 seconds. So in these 3 seconds, you wait and you click the autopilot off. But we'd gone to a new system now that the autopilot has to be asked, can I have the aircraft, by me? And to do that, you hit a button, but you don't get it immediately. It has to go in the transit time to the computer to come back to you to say, okay, you've got it. So in that extra time, you're extra low, and now you're heading for the end of the runway where the piers are, and the runways build up, and you bring the nose up as hard as you can, and you realize that you're rotating so fast that you're going to slam into the runway. So you flare it like a helicopter flare. And you touch down, and you touch down pretty soft, I thought. And you touch down not just on the main landing gear, but you touch down on all 4 landing gear. The nose gear, the center gear, the left gear, the right gear, and it's all simultaneous. And you add power to go around to do this test again, and you get a call from the back who's got all the instrumentation. They said, that's a knockoff. Your touchdown was at 14.2 feet per second. So they say it terminates the flight, so you come back around and you land, and they have to do a hard landing inspection. Now, years later, with just the same conditions, except this was on a FedEx airplane landing at Newark, they touched down at 14 feet per second. The gear broke off, the wing broke off, the airplane rolled on its back. The crew got out alive, but the airplane burned to the ground at Newark. So I look back on that, I said, because of that action, 2 actions, I probably saved the day, and they were both bad times, but they turned out okay. And go ahead.
No, so that was going to lead me to another question, and then we should probably wrap up. But I was going to say, what are you most proud of? Like, what plane or what action or what are you most proud of?
Probably, and this goes back to United Airlines, is looking deeper into the problems that occur with the end user, those pilots that are out in the field. And we evolved a pattern such that we'd evaluate an aircraft and we'd come up to a conclusion that, gee, this has been going on for a long time. And then we'd have to do paperwork research where you'd actually go in and look at the aircraft files and the logbooks to see whether they were doing anything about this. And this had to do with the automatic landing systems. Now, as a pilot, each pilot is required to get recertified to landing minimums. And the landing minimums may be an automatic landing, but come to find out, the FAA and the airlines in this era, that era that I was in, never had that requirement for the airplane. So we documented the flying that had gone on and our experience of where you're going in. And now, if this is the runway, you're coming in to intercept the localizer. The airplane would start S-turning, and that's a no-no. Or the glide slope that you look down that you want to intercept, the airplane would start porpoising along the glide slope. And both those things were caused by the on-course sensing of the avionics gear that you had on board was malfunctioning. The on-course was not working. Now the off-course was working, but the on-course wasn't. Same with the glide slope. So we ended up feeding this information in and requiring all our aircraft to have this. We fed that information into the manufacturer. We fed it into the FAA, and now it's mandatory for all airplanes to have to get certified that it's been done within the last 30 days or it loses its low visibility landing capability. And that's probably the proudest thing of my career.
Well,
And
I thank you.
You're welcome.
For sure, because I board those planes. Not often, but I do board those planes, and so do
Yeah.
my family members. 100%.
So that's probably the highlight, and it all comes from the feedback that you have from those that are actively flying the aircraft, but nobody's listening to them.
Hmm.
But we were. And the other thing I guess I'm proud of is the fact that United Airlines is still the only airlines that hires professional test pilots that are graduate of the Air Force Test Pilot School or the Navy Test Pilot School or the Empire Test Pilot School, which is the British one. And that is the only airline in the world that hires professional test pilots. The others don't.
Well, that's a shame. What message would you like to leave for future generations that will hear or see this interview?
Well, I would say to future generations, pay attention to the past and try to pass on the gifts that have been given to you, not so much by your own efforts, but by the opportunities others have afforded you.
That concludes our interview with Colonel Larry Otto. Thank you so much for your time today and for your military service.
Thank you.